Hello, Dr. Flavio here. Today, let's take a look at an analogy. Person goes to the gym to lift weights in order to increase muscle mass. So what do? We lift weights. And lifting weights simply just means that we're overcoming the resistance to the movement of that weight, right? The gravity imposes a resistance, an opposition to the intended motion. And that's what the weight represents, opposition to our intended motion. If we do that enough, with enough of a load, enough weights there will be tiny, tiny little micro tears in the muscle fibers, and the muscle will kind of regroup and regrow, but it's going to grow a little bit stronger each time. So it's interesting that muscle growth requires sort of breaking down muscle tissue, but in a very controlled and subtle way, because there's something that we call an injury. And that happens when perhaps the person didn't do the right movement, was too much weight, or they lost their balance, or something happened. Now maybe there was a tear, maybe a ligament tear or something. So it was too much too soon. Now there's an injury. Now they cannot go to the gym for a while. The point I'm making here is that life imposes a demand upon you every single day. Every day you got to do something that's slightly uncomfortable. And when you do something that's slightly uncomfortable, in fact, we call this, right, getting off of your comfort zone. Every time that you get off your comfort zone, every time you pick up a new book to read, a topic that you may not be as familiar with, you're sort of off of your comfort zone, but you stretch and you grow, just like the muscle. Tiny little micro tears, it's uncomfortable. Lifting the weight is uncomfortable. It's kind of heavy, kind of hurts a little. But if it's done in the proper degree, then the muscle eventually grows. In life, if problems arise in the proper degree, we grow on a daily basis. When you go to school every day, you take a new lesson, you do your homework, and you learn to read, you learn to write, and you kind of go along the school system and you learned something, you became a different person. All of that is fine and dandy, but what is the analogy to the muscle injury or the ligament tear in the gym? What is that analogy in life? Well, every now and then a person does break down. And in some cases, the breakdown can be so extreme that the person can have this psychotic decompensation. They may end up in the hospital. In Florida, we have this thing called a Baker Act. They take you to the hospital, they hold you for 72 hours to stabilize you. That can happen to a person because they broke down. There was a massive breakdown. Sometimes that happens. Other times, they will be exhausted physically and mentally, and they'll remain in bed for 2 or 3 days. They cannot speak, they cannot talk, they're just depleted, completely depleted. And after a few days, they sort of get up and they start thinking about life again, and they get back on the horse, right? They get back on the saddle, and they continue living their lives. So those are episodic breaks that can happen. But there's another kind of breakdown that is more systemic, because the person continues to somewhat function in their lives. They can hold on to a job, they can drive a car, they can even relate to other people, but they are at a very, very, very much reduced capacity. They're very focused on what happened, and as we explained in other videos, there will be trouble sleeping, functioning, something has broken. The question now for today is, how do we fix that? So I wrote a whole book about this. It became a bestseller a few years ago. In it, I outlined the 7 steps that we have to go through. In that book, Awesome Again, it's called Awesome Again, I also explain the whole, the neuroplasticity, the epigenetics, the philosophy, the mental aspects of healing from a major breakdown. It's a complex process. Most people cannot do it alone. We need help. And I think in that book, I used the analogy, your body produces, think about it this way. Your body produces heat normally. So if you go into a chilly environment, maybe walking to a store and it's really cold, you might shiver a little, you might contract, you might pull up your jacket, but your body is producing heat. And the production of heat, if you conserve the heat by covering yourself, then you sort of warm up again. So when we get cold, we can remedy the situation by producing heat. And shivering is one way to contract and relax muscles very fast in order to produce more heat. But if a person goes into hypothermia, if body temperature begins to drop and drop and drop, if they get lost in the mountain, in the snow, then the body's ability to produce heat itself is lost. Now the body is no longer producing heat. Now, even if the person gets a jacket, they cannot recover because the jacket doesn't produce heat. The jacket insulates the heat or protects or keeps the heat in the body, whatever heat is being generated. But if the body is not generating the heat, a jacket won't help. So now that person in hypothermia will need external heat in order to survive. You have to add, you have to heat them up, you have to bring up the temperature externally. Without external heat, they'll perish. I bring up this analogy because there's a type of breakdown that the person can take a few days off, they can go to a spa, they can go into a mountain, they can take a few days in the beach, and they will recover. That's like saying that I got chilly, I pulled up my jacket, and I warmed up again. That's one kind of breakdown. The kind of breakdown I'm talking about is like hypothermia. This guy's lost in the mountains in snow. The body's ability to generate heat has been lost. I'm talking about that kind of breakdown. They can no longer recover on their own. They can't, because the mind begins to loop obsessively into what happened, and now the resources, the mental resources to rebuild a life are gone. I explained in another video, the person will have trouble eating, sleeping, everything seems to break down. So how do we help that person? Listen, today I'm going to tell you one thing only. We have to help that person relax. Now, it seems easy. It seems like a normal, just relax. No, it doesn't work that way. The nervous system of that person is extremely upregulated, deep into the sympathetic range. In other words, they're extremely stressed. It's like a tiger's pursuing them. And there are ways of measuring that, autonomic balance, and there are all kinds of ways of measuring that. But if you don't have access to that equipment, I can tell you that to the person's autonomic nervous system, it is like a tiger's chasing them. They're in high sympathetic activation. So the first thing that we need to do is help the person build little moments of decreased sympathetic activation, in other words, relaxation. And we can do that by talking a certain way, sometimes music, focusing the mind on a particular task, maybe a puzzle. In other words, the person doesn't have a lot of capacity to focus, but little by little, we begin to retrain the mind to sort of focus on one point so that the autonomic nervous system can take a little break from this high sympathetic activation. At the office, of course, if a person comes to see me, they're all over the place, they're telling you the story, they're jumping all over the place, they're not quite making sense, which is normal, which is understandable. But what we do is I use hypnosis, because with hypnosis, and not the kind of hypnosis that you see, listen to my voice, relax, that does not work for the person who is in this breakdown mode that I'm describing. Because look, the moment you tell the person who is in this super high sympathetic activation mode, you begin to tell them, listen to my voice, you will now begin to relax. You begin with that 1950s type of hypnosis. It will not work because the person cannot listen to you and simply relax your legs as you listen to my voice. It won't work. The person can't do it. In fact, in that case, you're going to make the person even more upset because they almost feel insulted by the instructions. The only thing that you can do if you're a hypnotist in that stage, at that point, is to bring the person into the hypnotic state with what we call an instant induction, quick inductions. And in my classes, I teach quick inductions, but it takes 15 to 20 seconds, sometimes less, 10 seconds for the person to go into hypnosis. But it's the only way that you can help that person, because you can't really use this progressive relaxation. Listen to my voice. Your eyelids are now feeling very heavy. That stuff for a person whose nervous system feels as though they're being chased by a tiger, that stuff won't work. All right? So we need something called quick inductions, instant inductions, and hypnotic inductions. Then we can get the person, once they're in the hypnotic state, now we can use suggestions to help them relax a little bit and begin to down-regulate that hyper-arousal state that they're in. And it's going to take some time. It's just like going to the gym. Because the moment they come out of hypnosis and go home or leave the office, the first thing that comes to their minds, sometimes I joke, it's like the little monkey is waiting for you just outside of this door. I don't tell clients this, but I know what's going to happen. Once they go into hypnosis, they feel great at the office, but once they leave and they begin to remember the problem they're dealing with, the whole agitation comes back. So we have to continue to train the mind, condition the mind to remain calm. And we typically begin to work on sleep and diet, so that, because those two things, the gut-brain connection and so forth, they have to eat a little bit less and differently, and they have to begin sleeping again so that we can begin to build a new life. We're going to be talking more about this, and I love discussing this with you. Subscribe to the channel, send me your questions so that we can continue this dialogue. I'm Dr. Flavio, so happy to be here discussing this with you. Mega blessings.